Hello and welcome to my channel, Vice Rhino here. Today I'm looking at Mike Riddle again and taking on some of his more in-depth arguments against evolution. Let's go!
Welcome to Creation Radio and TV.
Oh hey, you got my message from the last one. See, that wasn't nearly as weird as looking directly into the camera and saying, "Welcome to Creation Radio."
I'm your host, Mike Riddle, the president and founder of Creation Training Initiative, or CTI. Our mission at CTI is to train others to do exactly what I'm doing here today, and that is to be able to speak and teach about God's creation and learn how to refute the teachings of evolutionism.
And you can do this all without spending a single day studying evolution in a classroom. Unless you did take some science electives while doing your degree in mathematics, in which case you probably weren't paying attention very well.
Well, today we have a very exciting topic for you. Matter of fact, it's going to be a topic that destroys half of evolution teaching.
But it will leave the other half completely untouched. Now I'll wager that the half that you're referring to is macroevolution. But as demonstrated in previous videos, that's not half of evolution, that's the result of long-term microevolution.
And it's called the origin of life. Now, when we talk about evolution, there's really three main areas we can discuss. One is cosmological evolution,
which has absolutely nothing to do with biological evolution, despite you creationists always lumping it in the same category.
That is the study and teachings about how this universe came into existence. Where did the matter come from to create this universe? Talks about the Big Bang, where stars came from, the origin of all the planets. A second area is called the chemical evolution, or dealing with the origin of life. And a third area is biological evolution, sometimes referred to as Darwinian evolution.
Okay, so when you said chemical evolution, did you actually mean abiogenesis? Because chemicals don't actually evolve to the best of my knowledge. They certainly interact, and molecules that are made of chemicals can naturally develop that are self-replicating, and eventually this can lead to what we would consider life. But evolution doesn't start until replication starts, and chemicals in and of themselves don't replicate.
How do we get this great diversity of life on this planet? Well, today we're going to focus on one of those, the origin of life. And why is this so important? Because, folks, if we can't get that first living cell, then the whole model of Darwin is based on faith. There's nothing to start with.
You know, even if we had absolutely no idea how the first living organism came into being, that would not make evolution a faith-based position. You guys seem to be under the impression that if science doesn't already know the answer, it must therefore be impossible. There is a shit ton of evidence in favor of evolution that has nothing to do with abiogenesis.
So if we can show the origin of life is not possible by any scientific means, that is a death knell to Darwinian evolution.
No. If you were to actually prove the beginning of life to be impossible, that would be excellent evidence for the existence of a supernatural being, but given the amount of evidence on the side of evolution, it would just mean that this being kick-started life and let natural selection take it from there.
Well, let's start here. How many different possible ways could life have originated?
Well, the most important requirement for the starting of life is the presence of a liquid solution and organic molecules. The liquid solution allows these molecules to interact. Now, water is generally thought of to be the best solution, but ammonia has also been posited as a possibility. This means that it's possible that there is life on Titan, the largest moon of Saturn, which is thought to have a subsurface ocean of liquid water mixed with ammonia. Europa and its vast ocean of liquid water is also a promising place to look. And this is just in our solar system, which is one of billions. So it's probable that there are, extremely conservatively speaking, several dozen ways to combine liquid solutions with organic molecules in a way that results in life.
Well, there's only two ways it could have happened. Either life was created by naturalistic processes, meaning evolution, or life was created by an all-powerful creator God. Well, Mike, you say, there's a third possibility. How about life came from outer space? Well, folks, that doesn't answer the question how life originated. It just pushes the question to outer space. How did life start out there?
Oh, okay. So when you asked how many ways are there that life could have come about, you were looking for a more broad answer, so you chose to boil it down to either science or magic. I'm a stick with science on this one. And yeah, anyone who takes panspermia seriously knows that it's not a solution to the problem of the origin of life, it's just a neat possibility to consider, and it's actually not that far-fetched.
So there's only two possible ways. Life originated by naturalistic processes, or there had to be a creator God. Now, what about our textbooks? What are they teaching in our schools? Well, let me read to you some quotes from some of our modern textbooks here. And we'll start with an earth science textbook. And this is what they're teaching. Life must have begun during Earth's first 1.1 billion years. Now, notice the words must have. Those are what I call fuzzy words.
Hey, the fuzzy words are back.
When you hear words like must have, it means they have no observational evidence. They just consider evolution true, therefore it must have, but no observational evidence.
No observational evidence in the sense that nobody was actually there 3.3 billion years ago to witness it, but observational evidence in the sense that we can observe the evidence that that is when life started. You do realize that there doesn't have to be a witness to the event in order for the evidence of that event to be observed, right? Or do you think it's impossible to convict a murderer who committed a murder with no witnesses? To continue that analogy, witness testimony is generally held to be of the lowest quality evidence in a court of law because of the subjectivity of the witnesses.
Here's a quote from a biology textbook. Life's building blocks can form spontaneously. Recent discoveries suggest that life was present within a few 100 million years after Earth's origins. Notice the word suggest again.
Yes, notice the word suggest. Now think of how science is always changing to become a better model of how reality works. Now think of how ridiculous it would be if they used certain terms, like instead of suggest they were to say proves irrefutably. There's always room in science for new data to overturn old conclusions, which is why when making conclusions they don't use terms that suggest that new data will never overturn their conclusion.
That's another one of those fuzzy words, meaning they have no observational evidence, but yet they continue to teach this as a fact. Here's another biology textbook. Somehow these earliest life forms appeared within 500 million years after the formation of Earth's first rocks. Notice the word somehow. They have no clue how this happened.
Okay, let's for argument's sake agree with your conclusion that they have no clue. You're wrong, but let's agree for now. Would you prefer they make something up rather than be intellectually honest? Oh wait, that's the creationist side, so maybe you would.
And then finally, here's a life science textbook. Eventually, some of these large chemicals accumulate became the forerunners of the first cells.
Really? You're going to take issue with the word eventually? All eventually means is that in the end, especially after a long delay. So what that's saying is it took a long time. Like, it was a process that took at least a few million years. Eventually is a pretty good word to describe that. That's not fuzzy at all.
Eventually. Notice again the fuzzy words. No observational evidence, but yet they get away with teaching this as a fact, when in fact the whole idea of the origin of life is based on faith.
And I look forward to your demonstration of that.
Now, before we get into this, before we get into all the information about the origin of life, we need to build ourselves a foundation. A foundation on some terms. We need to make sure we're familiar with some of these biological terms. And these are going to be very simple. For example, atoms. What are atoms? They're our basic building blocks of matter, basic unit of matter. Now, what do atoms do? Well, sometimes atoms will bond together to make things called molecules. And we're familiar with a molecule called water, H2O. So atoms bond together to make molecules. Now, molecules can bond together to make things called amino acids.
Well, they can make a lot more than that, but I'll give you that one for now. So far, so good.
Now, amino acids are going to be very important in this discussion. Why? Because they're referred to sometimes as the building blocks of life. If we can't get amino acids, we simply can't get life. So this is very critical to getting that first cell.
Again, I would agree with that, and I'm looking forward to your evidence that amino acids can't form naturally, especially since naturally occurring amino acids have been found on meteorites, as in these acids were made all by themselves out in space, link in the description, and also remember back when I said panspermia wasn't really that far-fetched? This is what I was referring to. We know that the building blocks of life can and have been known to form in outer space, so is it really that far-fetched to think that that's where they formed before bombarding Earth?
And then finally, our last term, proteins. Amino acids can bond together in a specific order to make something called proteins. So we've got atoms, we've got molecules, we've got amino acids, and we've got proteins.
Okay, I can agree with all those definitions with the caveats I've already presented.
That's all we need for this discussion. Now, let's go back to a famous experiment in the 1950s.
You're going to the Miller-Urey experiment, aren't you?
1950s, called the Miller Experiment.
Hold on a second, what about Urey? He contributed too. Credit where credit's due, man.
And some of you out there may remember this experiment talked about in your textbooks. Matter of fact, it was in the 1950s that it took place, and it is still in our biology textbooks today.
Perhaps because it was a very groundbreaking experiment. I mean, you have a degree in mathematics. Tell me, did they teach anything about Newton? Yes? But he did his work almost 300 years ago. Oh, it's still relevant today? How about that?
Now, what was this Miller experiment all about? Well, Miller created an experiment to create the building blocks of life. Now, notice I didn't say his objective was not to create life, but to get the building blocks of life. He wanted to show that we can get amino acids through naturalistic processes. So what Miller did is he built this thing called a spark chamber in his laboratory. And in there, he tried to simulate the Earth's early atmosphere, what he thought the atmosphere was like these alleged billions of years ago. So he put gases in such as methane and ammonia, and then he left oxygen out. Then he generated electrical sparks in there to drive the chemical reactions. And then it goes on to state that Miller got amino acids. And folks, that is a fact. Miller did get amino acids.
Yeah, that's a close enough description for me for now.
So now they're teaching, why do we need a creator God when we can do it ourselves?
Whoa. Back it up there, buddy. Nobody said that. Most scientists are happy to let you believe in your creator God, as long as you don't try to interfere with the scientific process. Sorry that the evidence doesn't point specifically to your God, but that doesn't invalidate the science.
That is basically what they're teaching in our state-run schools, our government schools today. You don't need a creator God. We can do it ourselves.
Well, actually, there's a pretty big problem in the American public school system, particularly in the South, where science teachers have a tendency to gloss over the subject of evolution, and as such, kids are coming through the school system loaded up with misconceptions about it. One misconception being that you can't be a Christian and accept evolution as true. There are plenty of Christians out there who do accept the facts of evolution, but for some reason, the rise of biblical literalism, this myth prevails.
But let's take a look at the rest of the story. Those critical parts that have been censored out of our textbooks. It's called science. Did Miller really use random chance events, or did he interject intelligence in this? Because, folks, the whole process of evolution does not allow intelligence. It's all based on random chance events. Secondly, how did Miller know what gases were in the early atmosphere those billions of years ago?
As far as injecting intelligence into the experiment, there is actually some validity to that point. That's why experiments of that kind are meticulously designed to simulate conditions as they would have been without outside interference. It's probably not possible to get it 100% perfect, but they do the best they can and keep that in mind when interpreting the results. Secondly, the scientific community is actually divided on what the makeup of the early atmosphere was. Some scientists who have conducted similar experiments hold that the atmosphere could have had up to 40% hydrogen, which would have made the formation of amino acids even easier than the Miller-Urey experiment predicted. Other experiments have used an atmosphere containing high levels of carbon dioxide and nitrogen, which creates nitrites that destroy amino acids. Such experiments have found that with the addition of iron and carbonate minerals, which the Earth has in abundance, amino acids still form despite the amino-killing nitrites. But you won't go into the experiments that get closer to the truth of the matter. You'll just criticize the original for not having been perfect to begin with.
He wasn't there. And third, a question they don't even address is what type of amino acids did Miller really get?
I don't really think it matters, as the point of the experiment was to show that amino acids could form naturally, which it succeeded in doing. Especially since our model of the early Earth has changed to show that the experiment was not accurate to the early Earth, and other experiments have had more success, such as the one published in 1978 by Akiva, Bar-nun and Hyman, Hartman, linked down below. Fun fact, Akiva, Bar-nun published a similar experiment in 1970 alongside no other than Carl Sagan himself.
They just say he got amino acids, and they might mention he got some that are used in life. But folks, the arrangement of amino acids and the type of amino acids are very important here. So let's start with number one. Did Miller use strictly random chance events? No, he did not. He relied on years and years of intelligence in the fields of chemistry and biology to set up his experiment.
Yes, he relied on years of experience to set up his experiment in a way that would accurately simulate natural conditions. I don't see the problem.
And secondly, what they don't tell you is he had a trap door in his experiment. And as soon as he got these amino acids, he pulled them out of there so they would not be destroyed. They don't talk about that in the textbooks.
If you're referring to his ability to take samples and record his observations, then yeah, I guess you're right. But as I explained, it was about seeing that if they could form on their own, which it succeeded in doing, and later experiments have shown how they could have survived a hostile environment.
Now, secondly, what about the atmosphere? Miller did not use oxygen in his experiment. Why did he not put oxygen in there?
Because all indications point to there being little to no oxygen in the early Earth atmosphere, so it would not have been an accurate simulation. You say you know about evolution, maybe you should look into this, because it was the evolution of life which converted carbon dioxide into oxygen, which gave us our current oxygen-rich atmosphere. That's one of the basics, and you should at least know that if you're claiming to be able to refute evolution.
Well, Miller was a very smart man. He knew, as we know today, that in the presence of oxygen, life could never start. Why? Because oxygen, folks, at the molecular level, destroys chemical bonds.
You make it sound like he kept it out to make sure his experiment succeeded. No doubt if he had left it in and his experiment had still succeeded, you would be complaining about how it wasn't an accurate representation of the early Earth atmosphere, since there was little to no oxygen in the early atmosphere.
Let me read you some quotes here from some science journals.
Ah, the quote mine. Always a creationist favorite.
Now, here's a quote from two scientists. One is a geologist, one is an astronomer. And they make this statement. Oxygen is a poisonous gas that oxidizes organic and inorganic materials on a planetary surface. It is quite lethal to organisms that have not evolved protection against it.
And since we know that there was little to none of it around when life began, this isn't a problem.
So right there they're saying, based on observable and repeatable evidence, that oxygen destroys chemical bonds. Now here's another quote from another scientist, and he states, "It is necessary to exclude oxygen in their evolution models for two reasons. First, all organic compounds are decomposed quickly in the presence of oxygen. Second, trace quantities of oxygen would inhibit the organic molecules from even forming." Did you get what those scientists just said? And folks, this is based on observable and repeatable science. In the presence of oxygen, life cannot start.
Ergo, there was little to no oxygen present when life started. I fail to see the problem here.
Even trace amounts will keep it from starting. That's why Miller had to leave oxygen out of his experiment. See, Miller was very smart. But the question is, how did he know there was no oxygen in the early atmosphere? But let's play along with this game for just a moment. Let's just suppose that at some point in the history of this Earth, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere. No free oxygen at all.
Okay, I'll bite. Now what, O wise creationist man?
So we take all the oxygen out of the atmosphere. And once we do that, folks, we have to take something very important out of the air. That is called the ozone. It is made out of oxygen O3. And you know what happens when we take that ozone away? We all become instant crispy critters.
Because we've evolved under the protection of ozone. But the lack of ozone would have allowed an energy source to kickstart life that wouldn't have been available with it, and would have been much more regular than lightning, and that would be the very radiation that you're complaining about.
because the ultraviolet rays of that sun will come down and fry all life or any potential life. Let me read you some quotes on the fact of no oxygen. And this comes from an evaluation of the geologic evidence from Geology Journal back in 1982, folks. We knew this all the way back in 1982, and it states, I quote, "There is no scientific proof that Earth ever had a non-oxygen atmosphere such as evolutionists require. Earth's oldest rocks contain evidence being formed in an oxygen atmosphere."
So I found Geology online and was looking for that quote. I managed to track down that exact paper despite the fact that a search through every 1982 issue of Geology for the word evolutionists came up with nothing. If that was actually a direct quote from the paper as you suggested, that search should have taken me directly to the paper. And just to clarify, in case some of you might try to suggest that it was supposed to have been a paraphrasing, he did say in the video, and I quote, and as part of my search I emailed him about it and he confirmed in his email to me that it was a quote, not a paraphrase. That seems to me to be a poorly worded summary of the abstract.
In other words, what they're teaching in the schools is absolutely against the scientific evidence. The evidence clearly supports this Earth has always had oxygen in it. But yet in our textbooks, they make this statement, oh, back then the Earth was different, meaning there was no oxygen.
Okay, it's clarification time. When I've been saying previously in this video that the early atmosphere contained little to no oxygen, I've been referring to free oxygen, or O2 molecules floating around in the air. It's entirely likely that there were plenty of oxygen compounds out there, like carbon dioxide, water vapor, and sulfur dioxide, but these do not have the same implications about the beginning of life as an atmosphere with an abundant free oxygen would. Free oxygen is what would have had a massive detrimental effect on early life. In fact, once life started producing free oxygen as a waste product, the oxygenation of the atmosphere resulted in what was most likely the largest mass extinction event in Earth's history. And that is what made way for us weird oxygen-loving animals to evolve.
Folks, that's not very scientific, that's faith. Well, let me read you a more recent quote here from Nature magazine. A recent Nature publication from December 2011 reports a new technique for measuring the oxygen levels in the Earth's atmosphere some 4.4 billion years ago. The authors found that by studying cerium oxidation states in zircon, a compound formed from volcanic magma, they could ascertain the oxidation levels in the early Earth. Get this now. Their findings suggest that early Earth's oxygen levels were very close to current levels.
Since your quote starts with the words, a recent Nature publication, I don't think that's actually a quote from Nature. So I searched for that quote and found it on Evolution News and Science Today, a website run by the Discovery Institute. Thankfully, they actually cited their source, and it was a paper called The Oxidation State of Hadean Magmas and the Implications for Early Earth's Atmosphere, linked down below. Now, that paper does not say that the atmosphere would have been the oxygen-rich atmosphere we see today, but an atmosphere with oxygen-rich compounds like water vapor, carbon dioxide, and sulfur dioxide. Remember my clarification about free oxygen? This is a great example. You're talking about free oxygen, or O2 molecules, floating around in the air, but the paper was talking about oxygen compounds. These results mean that current hypotheses of abiogenesis may need revision, but it does not render them impossible. Remember what I said earlier about science being open to new discoveries and change? This is exactly what I meant. Now, I'm not a scientist, so I needed a little bit of help with translating that paper, and so I found a popular magazine called Astrobiology, and a key phrase from that article is that the results do not, however, run contrary to existing theories on life's journey from anaerobic to aerobic organisms. The results quantify the nature of the gas molecules containing carbon, hydrogen, and sulfur in the earliest atmosphere, but they shed no light on the much later rise of free oxygen in the air.
In other words, folks, the scientific evidence clearly supports this planet has always had oxygen, which means life could never start.
From where you're standing, at best that means that life couldn't have started in the ways we have so far hypothesized about, or in the locations we've hypothesized. There could still be pockets of non-oxygen areas friendly to early life chemistry, and panspermia is still a viable option. Remember that one? Even if I grant you your point about oxygen, which is wrong at its premise, that still does nothing to make the origin of life impossible. It would just change the weight given to certain hypotheses, which we already have.
But here's the situation we really have. If there was oxygen, life can't start. If there was no oxygen, life can't start.
I don't recall you demonstrating either of those positions.
Let me read your quote from Dr. Michael Denton, PhD in molecular biology, and this man is an evolutionist, and he states in his book, what we have is sort of a catch-22 situation. If we have oxygen, we have no organic compounds. But if we don't have oxygen, we have none either.
I'm having a really hard time finding that quote anywhere other than on creationist websites. So I'm just going to give it to you and assume that it's an accurate quote and has not been taken out of context at all. I highly doubt that, but I'm just going to give that to you for the sake of argument. Clearly there is more to the story if someone who you admitted is an evolutionist could say that and still come up believing evolution is true. Did you read any of his work, or did you just copy and paste that quote from the other creationists? And even if he said that and meant it exactly in the way that you are implying, so what? The words, "we don't know yet," are the whole basis of science. Instead of giving up and saying, "because magic," scientists press on and try to answer the hard questions. We know that life is here, so we know that life must have started somewhere. So where and how did it start? Let's find out.
Folks, this is great news. Life can't start in the presence of oxygen, and it can't start without oxygen. So how did life begin? What are the evolutionists going to do?
Well, I can tell you what we're not going to do. We're not just going to sit there and think, I don't know yet. Must be magic. We're going to try and find out what was possible and what fits the data. It's hard work. It takes a lot more effort than finding small details that don't look like they add up if you give them a surface glance with a layman's knowledge.
Well, they come up with another story. They say life didn't start on land. Life started way down deep in the oceans. So far down there, the sun's rays could not penetrate. That's how we're told it happened now.
How dare they adjust their conclusions to fit with their data? The more honest approach would be obviously to, filter the data through their preconceived conclusions?
We crawled up out of the oceans. Let me read from some of these biology textbooks again.
Okay, but is it going to actually be a textbook this time, or is it going to be more quotes from the Discovery Institute?
Here's a very popular biology textbook, and I quote, "One hypothesis about the origin of life suggests that living things evolved around hot sea vents." In other words, in the oceans.
And considering what we know of tardigrades, that's definitely not out of the question.
Folks, the problem of life starting in the oceans is that it can't happen. See, there's a process called hydrolysis. Hydro meaning water. Hydrolysis literally means water splitting.
Well, one of the hypotheses of how life began, which takes hydrolysis into account, is that the metabolic processes would have actually predated life. This would have most likely occurred in the early ocean. Links down below.
As soon as any amino acids might have formed in the oceans, within a matter of weeks, they would have all been destroyed. Let me read you some quotes again about water, and this comes from the Encyclopedia of Science and Technology all the way back in 1982, and it states, "Besides breaking up polypeptides, hydrolysis would have destroyed many amino acids."
Are you taking temperature into account? The water on the early Earth would have been much warmer than it is today, like significantly warmer, and hydrolysis is greatly affected by temperature. Again, link down below.
And here's another gentleman, Richard Morse, PhD in physics, and he makes this statement. "Furthermore, water tends to break chains of amino acids apart. If any proteins had formed in the oceans 3.5 billion years ago, they would have quickly disintegrated."
Okay, you got me, fine, I'll admit it. Scientists aren't completely 100% sure how life started. But you know what? They have a much better idea about it than you do, because they asked these hard questions that you're asking. And rather than stop there and say, "must have been magic," They search for the truth. That's all the patience I have for this guy right now. This video is taking a lot more research than I originally anticipated. If he says anything interesting in the second half, I might finish with this video later, but if he just continues with his random quote mining, I can't promise that I'll ever feel like hunting down all of his vague sources. So feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, and you can also follow me on Twitter and Minds if you feel so inclined.